What was the motivation behind the early Christian writers? That's today's video for you. Well, I began thinking about this concept. The question had been posed to me before, like, what's the best explanation for why we have, let's say, the writings of Paul, or, why did the God, even before we get into Paul, like the gospel writers, why would why would the figures of the New Testament Gospels, like Peter and James and all the apostles, why would they have such great conviction and faith and to believe in the resurrection, if Jesus had never actually been resurrected and it had never really existed? Of course, the problem is that those characters, those apostles, are part and parcel of the same story, so you can't use that to say, well, because these people appear in a story, that means that the story is true. It's kind of like, that's, circular reasoning. So that's how I think you can explain, the best explanation for the conversion that took place. Now, Paul's a little bit more trickier, I think, because we don't know whether or not he really had some kind of meeting or hallucination. It's quite plausible that he had some kind of hallucination on the road to Damascus, but we don't know. He very well could have had some kind of experience from Jesus, and he may have appeared to him. But one has to ask the question is whether the appearance didn't happen or did not. Certainly, it kind of lends itself to maybe it did happen. The fact that Paul would go on to write, all these epistles that he wrote. I mean, what would be the reason for his conversion? Although the story says that Paul originally persecuted Christians, but do we really know that that's true or not? Just because it says it in a book in the New Testament Bible doesn't mean that that's actually. You're saying just because someone asserts something in a story doesn't mean. But we do have to wonder, what was Paul's motivation? Why was he writing? Why was he writing these things that again are lacking in detail, like the four Gospels, but certainly discussing about a Jesus figure that was in heaven, that was going to come back. But that in itself is nothing unique. There was other stories about rising and dying gods, so we could say, well, maybe he was just another cultist, and he was just, on that bandwagon to write his epistles in the same kind of vein. I will say that the Christian story itself is unique in the sense that, well, how many other people had come and been crucified, but the idea that a Savior God would have some kind of passion there, have some suffering that they had to overcome, and that they would the benefits of that sacrifice would be then passed on to not say constituents, but the people that the believers of that Savior God, was not a new concept. So there's a lot of parallels to the Jesus story, though. People say, well, you guys are trying to draw these comparisons to the rising and dying, Savior gods and things like that. The Jesus story is unlike any other story told. And to an extent, that is partly true, except that there are a lot of common themes within the Jesus story that do appear. So it's not so unique. Anyways, I digress, but the point of the video is what I'm trying to discuss here is that lost my train of thought. is that not rising, dying, Savior gods, but what were we talking about? We were talking about Paul and the reasons for his conversion, and so I don't really know. He could have had a hallucination. He could have had a meeting with the risen Lord, on the road to Damascus, and maybe his account, but it's probably less likely. These types of things just really, when we've had people make these assertions in the past, they've been not true. So why would, in this one instance, would it be true? Now, moving forward into history, I also have to contend with the fact that there were other early church fathers and writers like Tacitus and Lenny the Planter. Who were the other? Clement. There was just on and on and on. There were all these other early, like Roman church fathers. So they were writing things, but again, we have to look at the quality of what were they saying in the writing. But I got to thinking about that. I was like, okay, well, obviously these people thought, 200. 300 years after the alleged time of Jesus, that Paul's stuff was accurate and that this really took place. But again, that doesn't mean that it actually was a historical event, simply because some people thereafter decided to join in on the bandwagon and say, oh yeah, this Jesus character, this really, they just parrot what they read and say, yeah, it's true. I mean, they weren't eyewitnesses to it. I mean, they discuss it. And I think there is some problems in terms of what they actually believed, and did they believe what many Christians today believe? I mean, to some extent they did. I believe there was some differences, though. Not all of them were. I can't cite an exact example, but I think there were some differences. They didn't all, by hook or crook, they didn't all believe that, everything that Christianity today believes. Though, yes, true, much of what we have today is evolved over time. Back then, for the first 100-something years, you could see, like with the Council of Nicaea, what happened, where not everyone was believing the same thing. And so how can that be if this was really a historical event, and they can't corroborate? I mean, even the New Testament Gospels, are different in their accounts. And how do we explain that? I think, the explanation is that the reason that the Gospels differ is because it's fictitious. It's not, it's each Gospel writer since the first Gospel of Mark was written, Matthew just plagiarized and borrowed from Mark. And so when Luke wrote his gospel, he borrowed from Mark and from Matthew, and so on and so forth. By the time you get to John, which is why we have the higher Christology in the book of John than any of the other three prior synoptic gospels. It's way on steroids. It's completely different and why would that be? And like I've mentioned in my other videos about the dialogue that exists in all four of the different gospels, that, oh sure, there's some similarities, but how would they get all this new information? If the first one, Mark, doesn't contain that dialogue, how are you going to get to John and have all these elaborate stories, not to mention the fact that Lazarus, being resurrected from it, is never mentioned in the first three gospels? That's a little bit suspect, don't you think? I mean, wouldn't we expect to find that at least in the first, maybe the second, maybe the third, Luke, But no, neither one of them. So, how could they be that obtuse or that unaware of it and just leave it out? I mean, it's not just one, not two, but three prior gospels, and so it probably is not a historical event, nor is this Jesus character. But I did want to contend in this video with a little bit, look at the fact that, there were early church fathers, there were people that obviously believed in this, and so what would be the reason for them to even waste their time? I mean, if it was nothing more than some just story, why would they? And I'm sure we could sit here and formulate a dozen different reasons why, some person in the 2nd century, who was a Jesus follower, was a believer, in this emerging Catholicism, the Roman Catholic Church is what was happening at that time. We could think of a number of reasons. I think that's right. What I just said right there is one of the biggest reasons. Is it's the emergence of a new religion. It's the emergence of a new church in the making, a new religion in the making, Christianity. And so you see how Christianity was formed, and how it took root within the first 300 years of its existence. And it has quite an interesting past if you actually study it. But the problem, I think, is many Christians don't know their church history. They don't know their origins. Well, that was another person that wrote, was Origins. Wrote about things. So why were all these people writing? So I know that the Christian apologist says, well, the best explanation for why Paul and the apostles and any of these other church fathers were writing is because these events most assertively did happen. Well, I'm not so inclined to believe that, and neither are countless other scholars and historians that look and use the scientific method to evaluate the supposed or alleged evidence that we have, and I think it's shoddy at best. I don't think that it's, people look at the New Testament and say, oh, well, yes, that's our smoking gun. That's all when it's nothing more than just a story, and you can't say because the story tells you that this happened, that it did in fact happen, or that, that's how you're going to interpret whether or not it's true or not, is because the story exists. I mean, Moby Dick exists, but that doesn't mean it actually took place. Countless of other literary creations have been done throughout history, but that doesn't make it true. The Iliad and the Odyssey. I mean, there's all the stuff that was written that we can look at and say, okay, this is most likely not true. This is fiction. This is fairy tale. This is fable. This is folklore. This is stuff that's just made up. And why are we inclined to believe that it is true. And I think that those are the questions you have to ask yourself. But I did want to at least concede in this video that, okay, well, why was Paul writing what he wrote? What was the reason for his conversion? Why was Peter crucified upside down? Because he said he was unworthy. Well, we don't know that. I mean, if that's historically verifiable, and we can go back and there's extra biblical sources out there that can verify those kind of accounts, then I'm more inclined to believe, all right, well, there very well may have been a man named Peter, and he very well may have been an early Christian follower. May have been starting the early church Christian religion. And I'm willing to concede on some of those things if you can go back and find in history, extra biblical. But the problem is much of what Christianity asserts is, wrapped up in the New Testament, and there's very little, if any, extra biblical sources out there to corroborate the story. So it's very, very difficult for any level-headed, rational thinking person to believe in the Christian story and say, yes, it's absolutely true. But why were they writing these things? God only knows, right? Yeah, pun intended. I mean, who knows why they wrote these things? I mean, lots of people wrote, they said Muhammad wrote stuff in a cave, but we don't know that he did or that he didn't. We don't know that Muhammad even really existed. There's lots of, fictional characters that are created in literary writings, but that doesn't mean that those people really existed. And I think the evidence for Jesus and trying to find him in history is very difficult. I mean, outside of the New Testament Gospels and Paul's writing, I mean, what else is there? And some say that, well, that's sufficient. That's enough evidence right there. Well, not really. We ask for a little bit more when you've got writings about Alexander the Great and other individuals in history. We have a sufficient amount of other evidence out there to support our belief that, okay, this was actually a historical figure. So, anyways, I wanted to just touch on whether or not what reason the early Christian followers, the writers of Christianity, had for writing this stuff. And I mean, who knows? Any number of reasons could be the explanation, but we have to allow for the possibility that it could have been that maybe a man named Jesus really existed. But though I think it's very unlikely that based on the assessment and the information that I've looked at, I don't think, and most secular scholars out there, and some good historians are out there saying, no, we don't think that it passes muster. It's not going to, we can't say, yes, in fact, Jesus really existed, and we have all this overwhelming evidence for it when we really don't. And I think that's an honest read of the situation. I think that's being honest with what we have available. We have to allow for the possibility that there could have been a Jesus Christ, but there probably wasn't. We'll see you next time. Take care.